We'll start with BobFitrakis, who's a professor of political science at Columbus State Community College, also writer and publisher of the Free Press, and currently a candidate for Congress on with the Green Party. So, Bob, please.
Thanks. Simone reminded me that I actually knew Michael quite well and worked with him directly for 10 years. So let me, Michael himself, again, was a very guilty Catholic boy who had become an agnostic. I mean, it's Michael's stories are legendary. I remember when I picked him up in a Pinto, which was too small, and he had invited 2 more people for rides. He insisted on sitting on the hump of the Pinto. Although, at any rate, he worked with Dorothy Day at the Catholic Worker. He himself was raised in middle class affluence. His father was a Republican attorney, and all of that changed when he went off to Yale Law School and then began to hang out in New York City. So instead of being on Law Review, which he qualified for, he became one of the original beats, but a left-wing one, so to speak. And the whole notion, we really need to go back into this historical period. It's incredibly odd, right? In 1958, it was decided he was 30, so he's too old to be a young socialist. So he was going to go on the road like Jack Kerouac and write about America. And he traveled around, and what he found was what your relative, your famous relative Martin Luther King said is Michael Harrington rediscovered the poor, right? Is that Harrington's thesis in the book, right, is that the poor had become invisible, in part because we had built those highways, and they dropped down, and you could no longer see the tangible poor within the cities. And again, I went to Wayne State, so I know all about that. I would be at Wayne State, and when it rained really hard, people would come up from the expressways, suburban people, and look around. They didn't even know how to get home, right? They didn't know. To the northwest, you take Grand River. To the east, you take Gratiot. So they would ask me, as one of the few people they trusted, a white face there. And I'm being helpful. I would always tell them, look, you go up 2 blocks to Bethune. There's a little dwarf hooker working the corner. You hang a right. Head down there. You're going to run into Gratiot. Just keep heading east, and you'll make it out to St. Clair Shores. But that was, unless there was a flash flood and a thunderstorm, no one saw those conditions. People had moved out to the affluent society, right? And nor did they go, as Michael did, to the migrant farms or into Appalachia. Some of you may not know it. He was a professor of political science, but his actual master's was in Shakespearean poetry from the University of Chicago. He was a great writer. The book itself was actually his second book. His first book was one of the worst, most boring books he ever wrote, called The Retail Clerks, which was a project he'd been paid for to write the history of the retail clerks. But it's the Other America, which came out of a magazine article, which was written in 1958 and later became famous as a book. He expanded it because a 44-page or so review by an ex-Trotskyist, Dwight McDonnell, in the New Yorker. So the review of the book was about, a quarter length of the book. And a lot of it were these vivid descriptions of poverty. And he was able to show that 22% poverty at the time when Eisenhower leaves office. Kennedy was reading the book, and again, it was Martin Luther King who brought him on as an advisor to his movement early on in the 60s. But Kennedy was reading the book, or just read it at the time of his assassination, and Harrington is getting ready to leave the country, right? He sold the paperback rights for $500, which, who was going to read this small book? It then after that became at the time, the most reproduced social science popular book in history, in the Little Penguin edition. You know, I once asked him about that. Michael, why aren't you wealthier from that book? And he's like, well, he sold the rights, went to France, wrote a book called The Accidental Century, which is a brilliant, brilliant book predicting the rise of worldwide poverty, etc. But Harrington himself, the amazing thing about this part, right, is he's in France. He comes home a few days before Christmas, and he's got a call from the White House. Is that he's a socialist, right? Self-professed socialist. The White House is calling. He gets hired to work on Sergeant Schreiber's task force, and every memo he wrote with the ex-Trotskyist, still a leftist, Paul Jacobs, ended with, here's what we should do, but we shall never abolish poverty until we abolish capitalism. So all of that, can you imagine today these White House memos being written essentially by two open socialists, one from a renegade Trotskyist faction of Shachtmanites, Michael, and the other one from a well-known foreign. I mean, these guys were working for the White House. And Michael had to be, was very clear in his mind. He ended up leaving the White House in 1966 after suffering tremendous anxiety over, he said he, quote, became unstuck while making a speech because of the Vietnam War. He was absolutely convinced that the war on poverty was not a failure. It had lowered the rate from 22% in 1960 to 11% by 1966 when he left. But he said the war on poverty had been lost in the jungles of Vietnam. Is that war, and Johnson not wishing to spend money on a popular war, destroyed the most successful poverty programs in the United States. And when I helped found DSA with Michael, with some very famous people, Michael had a habit of attracting some of the most dedicated and brilliant people in America. Young graduate student Cornel West, another graduate student working on his PhD, Manning Marable, and then myself. They went on to be much more famous and well known. But Francis Fox Piven, we were all still working on poverty at the time of Michael's death. I spent 8 years in a commune on the east side of Detroit fighting Reaganomics with people from Acorn and a strange professor from Carleton College called Professor Wellstone, who would send me his students, and we all lived there in this thing. And again, let me end by, Michael died. I had the privilege of being with him a few weeks before at the, the socialist boot camps that they used to hold, where very famous figures would show up all the time. But when Michael was dying, of course, he was asked if he had any last words for his followers, and all he did was, so again, the struggle continues. The poor are no longer invisible, but the left is increasingly so. I think we need mass militants. One of the reasons I'm running for Congress, I want to cut the military budget in half immediately. When you're that addicted, you got to go cold turkey and rebuild America. So thanks for listening to me.